Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us at our event today. My name is Kristina Hook. I am the Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project in the Center for Peacemaking Practice at Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution. We're so glad that you can be with us today, and we have just a few points of housekeeping. The first is that each participant is set to mute when you come in. We would ask that you keep your video screen muted as it allows for a better connection. We are going to have 3 speakers today, and after the speakers, we will have a question and answer session. The way that we'll do that today is by asking you at any point during the talks today to write your question in the chat feature. Once we reach the question stage, I will go through those names in order, and I would ask you at that time, when I call your name, to unmute yourself and invite you to ask your question directly to an individual panelist or to the panel as a whole. In that way, we're trying to encourage as much interaction as we can in this format. I also wanted to give a special word of welcome and to thank you for joining us at what is now a new tradition at the Carter School. We started on Monday by recognizing the International Day of Peace, United Nations sanctioned holiday that's observed annually every year on September 21st. It's dedicated to world peace and specifically the absence of war and violence. It's an encouraged day for temporary ceasefires and for to give humanitarian aid into those areas of violence. But in 2013, the Secretary General of the United Nations also encouraged this day to be marked with an increased attention for peace education, calling this the key preventative means to reduce war sustainably. So here at the Carter School, we've had several exciting changes this year, including our name change, and we are marking International Day of Peace in a bigger way. We're having Peace Week. So all week long, we've been hosting a daily series of roundtables, webinars, workshops, and more to try and bring together both the Carter community as well as the broader public to dialogue about peace, conflict resolution, and justice. And as I said, this will be an annual tradition that we're very excited about. We're very appreciative of both our speakers and our audience who's joined us today. So I am particularly delighted as the Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project that you could join us today. This is our first public event of the fall calendar. And before I forget, I want to mention that you can always get more information about our activities and our upcoming events, as well as the research reports we'll be releasing at bep@gmu.edu. So a few words about what the Better Evidence Project is, because this is a new initiative for us. Better Evidence Project was launched in February of 2020. At this event, a workshop was convened by the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Milt Laurenstein, and George Mason University. It convened a group of 36 practitioners, policymakers, scholars, and donors to develop a plan to gather and produce better evidence. This group had identified 2 main areas for research. The first was developing a shared set of key measures for describing peacebuilding successes and effectiveness. And the second was asking how we can learn from local peacebuilding successes and to develop and communicate a stronger evidence base that's really based on the effectiveness of local peacebuilding strategies. So in short, we work to make a practical difference in ending warfare by facilitating and encouraging research that can guide practitioners and donors in their important efforts. Since its launch, we've been working diligently to establish BEP as a useful hub that doesn't replicate the good work of our other colleagues in the field. And we really see our efforts as unified around 3 goals. So the first is to promote the allocation of peacebuilding resources as predicated on hard evidence about what's effective. The second is to support, conduct, and disseminate research to develop such evidence and to facilitate the exchange of relevant ideas and information to the peacebuilding community and to the public. So we're so happy to be doing just that in this event today. And with this background in mind, the topic of today's panel will come as no surprise. We are gathered here today to discuss how we as a diverse group of peacebuilding researchers and other actors can approach this question of best evidence. While recognizing that many factors, including implementation challenges and politicization, can impact peacebuilding successes, Other debates question the best research approaches to warfare's complex problems. In this panel, we're going to present an overview of diverse scholarly approaches to these aspects of the peacebuilding puzzle. We'll focus on what each research approach can contribute for policymakers, practitioners, and donors in achieving measurable results. I am delighted to introduce two very distinguished speakers today who each bring a wealth of experience that spans from scientific excellence as well as deep experience with peace and conflict policymaking and practice. Speaking first will be Dr. Charles Chuck Call. He will speak on the variety of methodological approaches that he took in his book, Why Peace Fails, and he'll discuss what his diverse approaches uncovered and sort of contrasting how these methods may contribute missing data pieces. Thank you, Chuck, for joining us today. He is an associate professor of international peace and conflict resolution in the School of International Service of American University. In 2017, he served as senior executive advisor to the United Nations World Bank flagship study, Pathways for Peace, Inclusive Approaches to Preventing Violent Conflict. Chuck has written a variety of books that are almost too numerous to name. I'm just delighted that he can speak on what is one of my favorites today. And he was also, from 2012 to 2014, a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where he led the Bureau's conflict analysis team and oversaw the Bureau's operations in Latin America and the Great Lakes region. From 2012 to 2018, he served on the UN Secretary General's advisory group on the UN Peacekeeping Fund, and he previously worked in the policy planning unit of the UN Department of Political Affairs. He has consulted in Colombia and Chechnya with Human Rights Watch and has lived in a remote Salvadoran village of displaced persons during that country's civil war. He has conducted field research in such diverse places as Central America, Haiti, Afghanistan, West Africa, the West Bank and Gaza, Papua New Guinea, Bosnia and Kosovo on post-conflict peace building. He received his PhD in political science from Stanford University and his BA cum laude from Princeton University. Thank you, Chuck. Following Chuck's talk, we will have Dr. Margarita Tadevosyan, who will examine the successful prevention efforts that significantly reduced the outbreak of conflict in a variety of cases, highlighting how these findings might be applied elsewhere. We're so thankful that she is here today too. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Carter School Center for Peacemaking Practice. She is a scholar practitioner of conflict resolution and has extensive experience in convening and facilitating Track 2 reconciliation workshops, primarily in the South Caucasus. For many years, she's been collaborating with Dr. Susan Allen, who is the principal investigator at the Better Evidence Project, on facilitating conflict resolutions across the Georgian-South Ossetian conflict divide. She has also been involved in other forms of analytical work and conflict resolution practice in the South Caucasus, working with Turkish-Armenian and Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict context. She joined the Carter School as a full-time research faculty in 2020 after spending a year conducting privately funded research on preventing violent conflict and as serving as adjunct faculty at the School of American Service at American University. She is a Carter School alumna, having earned her PhD here in 2019. Her current research centers around generating improved evidence on preventing violent conflict, ensuring it is available to donors, policymakers, practitioners, and scholars. We're so delighted for what she brings to the Better Evidence Project and thank her for being with us today. And then finally, I'll be speaking from my own research background. I will be describing how I approach conflict research as a political anthropologist, and I will share original research findings from my multi-year ethnographic fieldwork project in Ukraine's armed conflict context. As I mentioned to you, my name is Dr. Kristina Hook. I am the Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project. I'm also a scholar practitioner, and I specialize in large-scale violence against civilians, including genocide and mass atrocities, as well as emerging forms of warfare and violence. I've worked in 23 countries around the world, including in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, East Africa, and the Caribbean. I received a joint PhD in peace studies and anthropology from the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and Department of Anthropology. And as my talk indicates, for the last 5 years, I've been focusing on Ukraine-based research, having conducted my fieldwork there, supported by the National Science Foundation, a USAID Research and Innovation Fellowship, and a US Fulbright Scholarship. Prior to my time in academia, I was a policy advisor at the US Department of State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, overlapping with Chuck, and as a political economic officer in an embassy abroad. I have also held leadership roles in 2 international NGOs, and those do shape the way I approach policy practice and scholarship today. We're so thankful for all of you for joining in, and Chuck, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kristina. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Kristina, it's great to see you, and congratulations on the new endeavor. It was a pleasure working with you. Now it seems many years ago at the State Department. I'm going to, as you see, I just had the idea to put my book cover as my virtual backdrop so you can see it. I'm doing the self-promotion thing that all of our advisors tell us to do in academia these days. It's a 2012 book from Georgetown Press. And what Kristina's asked me to do is concentrate on the methods that I used in this book. And that's, I think, what drew her attention to this work and invited me to join you. So I'm going to share a slide deck, and I'm going to skim over some of the slides. I'm going to talk about the results of the research, but really I'm going to skim over some of those slides rather quickly to focus more on the methods and try to finish a little earlier for our discussion, okay? So let's see if I can do this thing. I need to, hang on one sec. What happened to that thing? Okay, here we go. Hang on one sec, I'm working on it. There we go, screen this. Okay, what are you looking at? Can you see the slide deck that says why peace fails, the causes and prevention of civil war recurrence? Excellent, okay, I'm gonna start that slideshow and we will get into it. Okay, great. So I'm just gonna begin a little conventionally here and run through this. This is a book that I did because I genuinely wanted to know the answer to this question, which is why do some civil wars recur and others do not after they have apparently ended? And another way of saying that is why does peace stick in some cases but not in others? And so there's a number of explanations in the literature that are out there that I go into some detail in the book in the first chapter. There are political explanations about democracy and regime type, and social explanations about ethnicity and identity. Economic factors, as you probably can imagine, weak states, coercive military factors like third-party guarantees, or peace factors, we might call those. And of course, the characteristics of the conflict itself or the country, how long it's been going on, how big it was, how intense it was, how many casualties. I started by saying, you know what, I'm going to look at the quantitative literature. And I ended up doing a lot of qualitative work, and you're going to hear about both of those methods. And I'm going to start with the quantitative because that's what I actually started with. And I teamed up with an economist to do some of this quantitative work back in 2010 and 2011. And what I decided to do is I looked around at the data sets on Civil War. I decided that Fearon and Leighton's 2003 set was the best for reasons I can discuss. And the way I looked at the occurrence, I looked at civil wars, and then I looked at their recurrence after 2 years of no conflict, 2 continuous years of no conflict following the year that they were coded as having the last year of a civil war. One of the things I did was I had a low threshold for recurrence. And so I took the Civil War data set and I looked at the low threshold of recurrence was I looked at basically internal armed conflict. So the casualty level for recurrence was lower than the onset one for reasons I can discuss if you'd like, okay? Anyhow, I used this, basically I was interested in using quantitative methods in order to try to generate hypotheses and see if, based on the data sets, the recurrence operated differently than recurrence. At the time, there was not that much quantitative stuff that just focused on recurrence. And so subsequently, there's been more stuff, more work, including more work that looked at exclusion, something that I ended up landing on in my explanations. So what did I find? The findings of this quantitative portion affirmed a number of risk factors. It called into question some others, so that GDP per capita, kind of its statistical significance disappeared essentially for recurrence. It also highlighted the role of ethnic and religious fractionalization, but in a nonlinear fashion. So that one of the big findings of Fionn and Leighton, who was that ethnic and religious fractionalization wasn't statistically significant for them, and they go to and they use sort of GDP per capita and oil exports as proxies for state weakness, rather than economics, which is what Paul Collier and his colleagues used it for. And so, but in recurrence, these factors, using the same model and same regressions that Fionn and Leighton did, appear to be significant. And so that means basically that these identity factors are more important in whether or not peace can be sustained after civil wars in those conditions, okay? So the other thing I would say that, I mean, basically I spend a good chunk of the chapter I have on quantitative methods also critiquing quantitative methods and lamenting the weaknesses and limitations of that, okay? And I'm just gonna go through a number of these because I think it's important. This is the first time I've ever been able to present this component of this book in a presentation, and so I'm gonna list these things that I go through in the chapter, and I'm extraordinarily pleased at the opportunity to do so. The first is you have this unit heterogeneity, right? Which is we're comparing everything in a data set that's civil wars, but all civil wars aren't necessarily equal. If you think about El Salvador's civil war versus Russia's civil war with Chechnya, the UK is on the data set because of Northern Ireland, just like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and others, right? So fine, we have to draw the line somewhere in quantitative research, and so we're working with the imperfect. I understand that, but let's just remember how diverse this pool of cases are, right? There's questionable robustness as well, because slight changes in the model yield very divergent outcomes, okay? And one of the examples I use in the book is that Paul Collier, when I worked at the UN in 2004, I got some frantic phone calls because policy offices and the speechwriters were putting a statistic of how often negotiated civil wars fail into Kofi Annan, and they wanted to check with me about where that stat came from. I told them where that stat came from before they used it. But one of the things that happened is that Paul Collier has 4 different statistics of how often civil wars recur, and that's just one scholar using very slightly different data sets can yield very different outcomes, okay? And that's a reason that we should be cautious about overgeneralizing from these quantitative methods. They're poor proxies, so we have poor indicators for important concepts like state weakness, regional hegemons, exclusion, institutionalization. As I just said, state institutional strength, Fionn and Leighton used GDP per capita, and they use oil exports as a proxy for that, which may seem strange to you as it does to me. The World Bank has, I mean, there's some better indicators that are out there, by the way. So the World Bank has an index of institutional strength that's that I believe is better. So there's an omitted variable bias. So quantitative scholars, if we do quantitative methods, we measure what we look at what we can measure, and we can't look at what we can't measure. And so that means concepts like legitimacy, inclusion, and perceptions are often omitted, and that's a real shortcoming. And finally, this is not a critique of the method, it's just a critique of those who care about the implications of the method and its applicability to policy. And that is that it has limited policy applicability because many of the cross-national indicators that we have are available for more static risk factors, like income inequality, like GDP per capita, like infant mortality rates, than they are for triggers and precipitating causes. So rising frustration among the population, cross-national data sets have more difficulty capturing some of those things. So those are some of the weaknesses that I point out to using quantitative methods. And then I move on to use, so I mean, I had already decided I was going to use qualitative methods. I'm not going to be disingenuous and say as a result of these limitations, I decided on qualitative methods, because that's not true. But I think it's important that I did find some things that were worth looking at, which is ethnic and religious fractionalization. And so I looked at those a little bit more carefully because of this quantitative approach that I took, okay? Then I turned to my qualitative bit. And in the qualitative bit, I did 3 different qualitative bits in this I decided to do. And the first thing I did was I decided to dig deeply into one single case. It's a case that I don't have field experience in. I mean, I did go to Liberia at one point briefly to do some research on post-conflict peace building, but I'm not a scholar of, I'm not an expert of West Africa or Liberia, but I did a secondary literature case study of recurrence in Liberia. And that was something that I used to generate the argument that I ultimately adopted. I'm just going to jump ahead to the argument, then I'll go back to the qualitative methods. And this ended up being the argument that I made in my paper, which is that perceived political exclusion plays a more common causal role in recurrence of civil wars than, that should be than, not that, than social or economic factors, okay? And so as a result of that, I basically suggest that a more legitimacy-focused peace building is more appropriate for post-conflict efforts than capacity-focused, because there's a lot of capacity focus in United Nations agencies and technical donors, et cetera. So let me go back to these methods. The second thing I did was there were 15 what I call clear-cut cases of recurrence. And I did basically, I put 3 or 4 of those in each of a number of chapters, grouped them together, and I did many case studies. So a third of a chapter on each of them roughly, in which I looked explicitly at what hypothesized variables looked like, including economic causes, identity causes, resource causes, political causes, and I looked explicitly, of course, at this exclusion-inclusion argument. Basically, what I found, I mean, I didn't start out thinking this, but I came to the conclusion much more than I expected at the beginning, that a lot of these cases recurred because one party to conflict perceives that it's been excluded in ways that was not part of what they expected at the conclusion of conflict. That's true for both victories as well as for peace negotiations, okay? And so there's a resentment by the more losing faction that wants to come back and take up arms again because it feels like what it thought was the deal has been abrogated. And so there's a perceived exclusion that's taken place. Charles Taylor's Liberia, in the recurrence that took place, the first Civil War ended at roughly 1997, and the second Civil War commenced in 1999. In that interim, you can show that perceived exclusion being a very strong factor in that recurrence. And so I do that in this chapter. I'll tell you what those cases are shortly. But the last thing I did was I took a number of so there were 27 non-recurrences of the pool. And what I did was, rather than go through them in a more case-by-case fashion, I looked at them and I looked at how I grouped them together in ways that what they showed, and I drew lessons from them, and I made a thematic analysis of those cases of non-recurrence and put that in a chapter where I drew generalizations from them. At the end of all this, I'll tell you what I argued, but that's essentially what the method was, okay? And I'm just going to tell you BLUF, that's an acronym I learned at the State Department. Bottom line up front is that I think this work has suffered because the quantitative people didn't like it, because I didn't do a thorough, serious, and embracing study of a quantitative method. The qualitative people didn't like it so much because it's not deep anthropology of anything. I didn't do primary research on Liberia, for example. And so I combined methods that that some of the purists didn't really consider to meet snuff by some folks. I've gotten some very good feedback for this. So Barry Posen really loves the book, teaches with it. Other people have told me they teach with it and like it. But I think that's one of the deficiencies. That's one of the downsides of my using these multiple methods. So we can get into that. So I'm not going to give you the if you want to ask about the argument in more depth, we can talk about it. I just sort of want to skip through and just illustrate for you a little bit. These are the core cases of recurrence that I mentioned with the years of first and second iteration. I'm sure you'll look at that and say, oh, I'm not so sure I agree with that. I'm not so sure I agree with that. Most of the presentations I've given of this book half of the discussion has been people saying, excuse me, I work on Guatemala and I think you should have included Guatemala. Or excuse me, I don't know why Peru was on that list, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm happy to get into that, but that does tend to be what some people have focused on and be concerned about, which I understand. I'm just going to run through the findings very quickly, and that is, I think exclusion was the main precipitating factor based on my qualitative work in 11 of 15 court cases, okay? And there's separatist and non-separatist group, as well as severe chronic exclusion in these different types of conflicts. One of the things that happened is that power sharing was part of several of these instances, and a violation of that power sharing occurred in 40% of war occurrences, which a violation of a power sharing agreement is essentially a very formal example of what I'm arguing is important, which is a violation of perceived expectations about inclusion in a political settlement after war. In all of these cases, there were other factors that were present, economic factors I go into, and I acknowledge those in the case studies, but the exclusion was the most consistent and prevalent trigger in these cases. So, one of the things that came out of this is that I became unexpectedly a fan of power sharing. And a lot of African scholars and African policymakers don't like power sharing because they've seen it misused, justifiably, in places like Kenya and Zimbabwe. But in this case, but basically my study showed me that power sharing actually is highly correlated with non-recurrence, and it's rather important. And these are the cases sorted by power sharing, and whether you had recurrence or non-recurrence, and whether or not the sorry, this is not the power sharing slide. This is the whether or not the agreement was abrogated or expectations were abrogated or not. And this is the cases that are there. And this is the power sharing slide that shows the cases of power sharing. So, and there's only 2 cases that essentially don't abide. And looky there, Mali did eventually recur. This was written in 2012, so it was before Mali's most recent civil war. So, I think I'm going to, I have some theoretical implications for this study about exclusionary behavior. And so I think, and I'm just going to run through those in 60 seconds, if you don't mind. And that is, one of the findings I have is that national actors are really central actors in war recurrence, but international third parties condition those decisions in important ways. And so this really reinforces the role of national actors rather than looking at international policies of peace building, et cetera. The second thing, political decisions or systems that exclude certain groups are the first line of factors, right? That's sort of the argument, the central argument. And then state legitimation is crucial for sustained peace, not just capacity. And electoral democracies that don't focus on ensuring the participation and inclusion of losing parties are ill-advised, is one of the implications of this as well. This also undermines some of the key assumptions of liberal peace building about individual preferences being important, because it really points to communal level factors and inclusion of communities, particularly communities that are armed actors purported to represent, sort of not the guerrillas themselves or the state armies that lost, but the populations that they purported to represent, okay? I think I will, here's another set here, but I think I'll close there and turn it over to Margarita and leave and welcome questions that may come later. Thank you. Let me figure out how to not share this.
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate that. And I'm already jotting questions down myself. I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions as our speakers are talking, you can write that into the chat feature and we'll get to those at the end. Thanks. The floor is now yours, Margarita.
Thank you. And I am actually very happy that I will be segueing Chuck's presentation, because uncoordinatedly, they tie together in such perfect way that I did not even expect. So it's actually perfect. So what I will be presenting today is just part of my research that was focused on the role of international organizations and what their and how they were able to, in several cases, successfully prevent escalation of violence or stopped the hostilities that were happening, and I looked at the to speak a little bit about the methodology. This was a secondary data review, a desk study of 18 cases all around the world, including Bolivia, Colombia, Estonia, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Guinea, Guyana, Honduras, and Nicaragua, Kyrgyzstan, Lebanon, Malawi, Nepal, Nigeria, Sudan and South Sudan, Tunisia, Ukraine before up until 2001, Yemen right after the Arab Spring. So these are some of the cases that I reviewed, and this was a qualitative study to understand what did the international organizations involved in this preventive efforts did to help reduce the escalation of violence or prevent further spread of the violence. And the organizations that I reviewed for this particular, or the international organizations that were involved, mainly this was a UN-led effort, or Organization of American States, Commonwealth, and OSCE. So those are the four major international actors. While the report uncovered different aspects or different things that were done to help in the conflict prevention effort, I want to kind of focus on one particular one, which is the inclusion. So as Chuck mentioned in his presentation, the reoccurrence of the civil war or the conflict in the cases that were reviewed could have been attributed or can be attributed to the fact of exclusion of certain groups from the power sharing agreements or from any type of peace work. And so this, the other angle or the other side of the medal that I was able to uncover was exactly the opposite, how the inclusive approaches developed by international organizations were helped to reduce reoccurrence of the violent conflict, or were able to halt the spread of the violence. While the idea of inclusion seems to be very self-evident, the looking at these cases helped to highlight not only the very evident aspects of inclusion, but also an additional dimension to our understanding of inclusiveness, and provide significant evidence that allows to argue that direct communication with low power side of the conflict and their inclusion in the process of prevention allows the de-escalation of the tension. And participatory and inclusive approaches also allow to generate significant public support towards intervention, and which helps to strengthen the position of intervening organization. One of the classic cases that usually gets mentioned when we speak about the prevention is the case of Macedonia, where experts a lot of times attribute the success of the violent conflict prevention to the working group of on ethnic and national communities and minorities that existed in the preventive efforts set up by OSCE. And this group not only brought together international actors with Macedonians and Albanians and facilitated the development of personal contact between the leaders of different ethnic groups, but it also included the other, like the Serbs as a low power group in that particular conflict, and provided a platform where in an inclusive way, concerns of many sides were heard and voiced. So this, when speaking about inclusiveness, I think what the research helps, this particular research helped me to understand is that we need to go beyond the traditional focus, especially in the case of ethnic conflicts, of just having two ethnic groups or national minority groups. And inclusiveness in this case implies working with a wide range of actors that represent different segments of social, political, cultural, economic life of the country, in particular in the areas when we are applying the preventive action. A case of this wider conceptualization of inclusiveness can be Guyana, where shows that intervening organizations encourage participation of wide range of local actors, from law enforcement representatives and up to academia and university professors. OAS was able to promote a structured dialogue between with the participation of all major stakeholders and open, inclusive approaches that accounted for the views of many parties. Another important aspect when we are speaking about inclusiveness in preventive efforts is the kind of geographic inclusiveness. It's not only looking at what type of stakeholders you are bringing to the table, but also where they are physically located. There is a tendency, and the reviewed cases that I looked at allude to that there is a tendency for international organizations on going in kind of reach for the lower hanging fruit in terms of an easier access points, and that usually implies working or including the parties or stakeholders that are centrally located, leaving the periphery largely uncovered. So in this case, inclusiveness needs to be understood in a broader sense and includes not only inclusiveness of actors, but also how geographically distributed they are, and trying to cover as much geographic ground as possible, like reasonably possible. The other aspect of inclusiveness that I want to highlight is going beyond traditional opinion shapers. There is a lot of evidence and also the tendency of trying to work with opinion shapers and use their influence with an understanding that at some point it's going to cascade down to their constituencies. This approach, while has very powerful backing and has been used many times in practice, but also it has a potential of leaving out an important layer of the society and also jeopardizing the credibility of the preventive action. The preventive action, for example, in Guyana provided evidence that expanding the buy-in from all the levels of the society is foundational for the successful prevention. In this case, the UN was facilitating the preventive action, where they took very active steps to include actors from the Guyanese society outside of the political and military leadership, to bring them into the conversation, and focused on working with the women's group, with the different actors in the civil society. Similar thing happened in Yemen, where students and other groups were included in the conversation. And actually, maybe Chak can speak to that as well. But in Yemen, the recurrence of violence and then the fallout of the peace process is largely attributed to the fact that while these groups were included initially in getting their concerns, they never became the part of the power sharing agreements that were generated afterwards, and that led to escalation of violence later on after 2011. I guess another aspect that I would want to kind of point out when speaking about the inclusiveness of the preventive action and how it actually helped to reduce the spread of violence or prevent the escalation of violence is trying to create forums that were parallel to each other, creating separate platforms for separate groups, while it is recognizing the inability of bringing all the groups together. So in particular, this was evident in the case of Colombia, for example. It was a nationally led process. The Colombian peace process were nationally led process where UN was very cognizant of not to overstep, but at the same time, it was to make sure that the process is not completely exclusive. They facilitated these public forums where around 3,000 citizens' proposals were generated and submitted to negotiating parties in Havana at that time, and 12-person victim delegations were selected to participate in the talks in Havana. So the victims of the FARC and Colombian government clashes are the most underrepresented and marginalized and neglected group in the Colombian context, are considered to be. And this was the first time that these groups were able to participate or be their voice, their concerns, their views or their narratives be heard at this forum. So again, this was one of the other important components where, while you can provide for inclusiveness and you can create inclusiveness without undermining an already established process or the political process that goes on, and you can act as a supporting pillar and create a parallel, synchronized and supported mechanism that kind of fits into the official process. So in the final, I want the one final aspect that I want to kind of underline in terms of when talking about inclusiveness in conflict prevention, it's also developing inclusive practices of the intervening organization. So that component, I guess, would be one of the less talked about in not only in the policy circles but also in academia, how the intervening organizations themselves as kind of a high power structures come in and create create an environment where they are generating, they are building their approaches with the internally, organizationally, in a more inclusive way. So giving, understanding the value of national staff from different political, social, cultural backgrounds can and has played a significant role, for example, in case of Bolivia, in developing data and developing approaches for the UN mission there that helped to created a foundation for more inclusiveness of the preventive action itself. The same thing in case of Nepal, where the UN mission in Nepal created an effort to enhance the representativeness of the UN staff profile. The resident coordinator initiated a UN country team-wide joint UN trainee program for socially excluded groups, which helped to increase the pool of qualified candidates among historically marginalized groups. And this could serve as a model for UN country teams as well elsewhere. So these approaches can help to build conflict sensitivity into operations of the intervening organizations and strengthen their preventive action by practicing internally what mission preaches in its interventions. So this is, I think, an important component that is usually not underlined or not voiced enough for international organizations, but there should be a very much internal reflection into own inclusive practices when trying to generate or support or call for inclusiveness of the peace processes. So just to kind of quickly summarize, and I'll leave kind of time for the questions at the end, and I can explain or provide more details if there are questions. But I guess the importance here is to think about inclusiveness in the broader sense, which includes the inclusiveness, increasing the inclusiveness of the conflict action, both geographically and on the issue areas. At the same time, inclusiveness does not mean dumping all the issues or all the actors together and trying to analyze and find relevant platforms that can act and action simultaneously or in parallel with a final goal in mind and trying to converge them at some point, and also developing inclusive practices of the intervening organizations. And I'll stop there and I will answer questions if they come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margarita. It is so fascinating when all of these presentations have been developed on their own, but they're really pulling together, I think pulling at the threads of something larger. So I think Chuck has emphasized for us this theme of legitimacy. Margarita's built on that by really highlighting inclusivity. And now a core theme that's going to emerge from my presentation is perceptions. So again, trying to understand what these various actors may be perceiving and how that drives their behavior. So now it's my turn to screen share. And I promised in this talk to give some details through an applied case study of how a political anthropologist like me approaches this topic of preventing and reducing warfare. And so when putting together a presentation like this, it's a bit tricky because you want to say something to your colleagues, to any anthropologists that might be listening, while also speaking to so many of these interdisciplinary circles that we find ourselves in. So I will be focusing on the topic that was my dissertation and that will eventually be my book. Let's see if we can start screen sharing. So can you all see? Can you all see it?
We can see it.
Great.
And we can see the slide deck.
Excellent, great. Okay, so when I approached the issue that I wanted to study for 5 years, there was really what I felt was a research gap, because we know that narratives of suffering are established as driving political processes. And I have a few of these examples, starting from the middle, close to home. It's a White House advertisement to petition the White House, ask your US representative to call on President Trump to honestly commemorate the Armenian genocide. The picture on the left is a march commemorating Chile's military coup in 1973. This is a march that occurred 40 years later, commemorating and honoring those who died or were disappeared. And then on the right, we have the president of Burundi at the time this picture was taken, using historical narratives of past violence in Burundi to say something to his constituents today. When I looked at these, I wasn't satisfied about the level of granular social scientific data that we have on understanding how these processes unfold, particularly as they're driven by different types of influential stakeholders. So this is my sort of big anthropology slide. I think this is what speaks to my anthropology colleagues, but I think it also puts you in the mindset, because one thing that anthropologists like me love to do and are trained to do is to try and unpack assumptions. So when I was looking at this, at narratives of suffering and driving political processes, you start thinking about the concept of disaster itself. And so after disasters, you can consider an individual, a collective, a society's worldview or cosmology is a richer term, really shattered. And as that needs to be rebuilt, narratives of suffering become an integral feature of the process for doing so. And these disasters become particularly acute when they're disasters of violence, when there's compounding questions of guilt and those who participated. These processes of rebuilding shattered cosmologies are characterized by a high degree of fluidity, they're inherently unstable, and social negotiation. So in this context, influential stakeholders often play an outsized role. And what do I mean by an influential stakeholder? For me, that's someone who uses discourse as a political tool, someone who's good at persuading others, who's exerting leadership through discourse. Within all of these narratives of suffering and these unstable processes, genocidal narratives of suffering exist as a special and morally untouchable case. This is due for a lot of reasons that I go into in my longer works, but it really is connected with their emotional salience and their scope. But what really adds complexity here is that genocidal conversations are characterized by two things, and that is definitional disagreements and what I call conceptual slippage. Everyone is talking about a slightly different thing by using highly loaded words like this. And when I started this project, I had really identified through my own background in the field of genocide studies that there are 4 groups where these differences are really pronounced due to the different ways and purposes that they use terms like genocide, as well as their different professional training. And so these groups are lawyers, academics, politicians, and activists. So that's what I set out to study. I went to Ukraine, which has a narrative of a historical genocide. And I wanted to understand and to map out the interactions of these 4 social actor groups regarding what they tell in these narratives. And I loved a point that Margarita just made where you talked about how there's different levels of people going beyond the traditional opinion makers, because that's also what I found in my work. There's sort of those who succeed at traditional media or those who succeed at new media, things like that. So even within these categories, there's a high degree of variation. So what I was looking at was the narratives that they tell regarding the Holodomor, which is something that occurred in 1932 to 1933. And it really is best to speak of it as a political, a demographic, and a cultural catastrophe. So this was a time condensed period that killed approximately 4.5 million people. This is a contested number. The number I'm using here is from the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, which has compiled, I think, some of the most robust demographic estimates. And it was an artificially induced famine under Joseph Stalin, which killed these people. And one of the reasons that it's kind of important to talk about the Holodomor as different than other Soviet famines was due to the question of whether there was specific Ukrainian targeting. So the case for that, which is promoted by Ukrainians as well as groups of international scholars, they point to things like a deadly combination of grain requisitions, unworkable grain quotas, documented evidence of denial of requested food aid, the seizure of food and seeds and farming equipment from peasants who are already starving, and then infamous blackboards where villages were sealed to prevent hunger-driven out-migration. And those who did manage to escape, there's documented records where they were seized from train stations and brought back into their villages where they most often died. So how did I take on this project? So between the period 2015 to 2019, I spent 2.5 years conducting ethnographic fieldwork in Ukraine. I was based in Kyiv, which is in the center of the country, but I did site visits and collected data to 31 other cities, towns, and villages. So I did formal interviewing with more than 100 high-level stakeholders. And I use that word high level, but again, it's really people in their various circles who are influential and who are using discourse as a political tool. This process generated more than 1,000 pages of qualitative data. And as I was doing this, I was also gathering data by doing participant observation across these 4 fields. And so what we mean by that is I was accompanied and sort of embedded with the figures that I was interviewing as they interacted with people in various ways and in various circles. So for example, I would look at how they trained younger members of their profession and what they would say regarding this topic there. I would look at how they talked about this topic publicly to their constituents. I would look at how they talked about this topic internally with members of their same profession, and then also with their colleagues across these 4 different fields, because many people switch across these 4 fields. So this included things like academic conferences and lectures, politician-led commemorations. I did a lot of elections-related things in Ukraine, activist meetings, both private ones and public exhibitions, congressional debates, congressional strategy sessions, diplomatic events, museum galas, and judicial hearings, all the time gathering data on what was being told. And this is all taking place in the context of armed conflict. And it's important to recognize that there's two armed conflicts really occurring in Ukraine, and they're very different. So the first is in southern Ukraine, which is the Crimean Peninsula. It was seized in 2014, and it's openly controlled by the Russian Federation. This is contested under international law and disputed by most international actors today, but it is something that's open. The second armed conflict is occurring in eastern Ukraine. It's 2 provinces that are controlled by separatists receiving technological, military, financial, and diplomatic support from Russia. One of the most infamous public incidents that happened during this armed conflict was flight MH17, which was shot down over eastern Ukraine. And this really highlights the debate that's going on there, because the nations of the Netherlands and Australia are proceeding in international court cases to formally charge the Russian Federation for its soldiers both providing the Buk weapon as well as their official soldiers shooting it in Ukrainian territory where they were not supposed to be. So, but it's very different. Crimea is sort of an open situation. Donbass has a lot of layers of deception, and that does impact the way that you collect data and what it's going to tell you. This armed conflict, just the overall snapshot, is that the UN estimates that 14,000 people have been killed since 2014 in eastern Ukraine, 30,000 have been wounded, and there are 1.5 million internally displaced persons. So what did I find? Again, speaking very briefly, but what I found was over the past 28 years, from Ukrainian independence to 2019, the Holodomor emerged from this heavily suppressed, illegal remembrances that were suddenly illegal but still very taboo to talk about, from a diffuse set of suppressed memories and recollections to something that I, as apologists, would call a performed narrative. And when we use words like performativity, we're talking to a specific type of theory. We don't mean insincere, but we mean something that matters, that is deeply held by that person, and in so doing, it shapes their behavior and it shapes the context around them. It's also what a foundational anthropological work in 1926 called a charter myth, and that's a story that a society tells itself about who they are, who they should become, and who they were. And so the Holodomor has become this type of very important charter story for Ukrainian national identity. And what happened and what surprised me was that across these 4 fields that I was studying, I really expected a lot of vociferous debates like I have on every other case of genocide. Something called narrative convergence had occurred. The stakeholders were all saying very similar things, which was highly unexpected. Ukraine is a country that has a lot of very high energy debates, I would say. And so suddenly when you have everyone saying the same thing about a contested topic, it was very interesting to me and I wanted to know more. So I looked at this process, and in my larger work, I map it out. How did these nuances decrease, and how did these narratives converge? And how we might use these kind of methods in another case to really track a narrative that is so important domestically and may or may not be picked out by outside observers. So there were just 4 elements that I'm going over very briefly, but by the context of the war, there were 4 elements in this converged narrative. The first was that the Holodomor was intentionally waged by authorities. So alternative explanations of Soviet incompetence or drought were not counted in this narrative. Genocide was also the marked category, meaning people who said that it wasn't a genocide were more significant, were more unusual to see. Also, there was a heavy push to talk about the Ukrainian specific targeting of the Holodomor, even in relationship to other Soviet famines. There was a lot of sympathy expressed for famine victims in Kazakhstan and elsewhere, but there was also a heavy emphasis for them on what made the Ukrainian case different. And then also in the modern context, we saw a focus on perpetrators. So instead of just proving that this was a historical event that had happened, which was itself an uphill battle, this topic was illegal for many, many years, many decades to talk about. But there was now in modern Ukraine a focus on what to do about the perpetrators, a focus on justice. And as you can see, that's something that really is impacted by the current armed conflict with Russia. So one of the ways that this plays out when I look at periods in Ukraine is that it highlights, you can model this discourse in all these different social fields, and you can begin to look at internal perceptions of crisis. And so when I lay this data out, you can kind of see 3 primary periods where this narrative is undergoing a lot of contestations until it ultimately converges. And so the first kind of indicates that Ukrainian-Russian relations was somewhat fraught after the Soviet Union. There were really important issues such as control of Crimea, control of nuclear weapons, control of the Black Sea that were important, but more or less these disputes were able to be worked out, even if not always to the full satisfaction of every participant. They were viewed as legitimate. That does begin to change really in the 2000s. There's a period of real political identity vacillations going on. And the Holodomor begins to emerge as this primary narrative that either indicates leaning into its Eastern past, of talking about a shared Soviet tragedy of all these famines, or something that should singularly mark out Ukraine as a unique victim that's trying to lean away from the sphere of victimhood. And then this really all came to a head after the Euromaidan revolution, after their president fled. Crimea was seized a few days later. And so this narrative really converged in this period of high level, very salient crises all coming together. So there are just a couple of functions. I'm going to just breeze through this, but there's things that the Holodomor is used to express that talk about the reclamation of Ukrainian identity and pride, as well as the absolution for Ukrainian roles in other things like the Holocaust. The Holodomor narratives are also used to express resistance to what people feel as a current existential threat perception in the face of what they always call Russian neo-imperialism. But then it's also used in really subtle ways for camouflaging. So by leaders who are concerned that there are pronounced regional differences in Ukraine, and they sort of were hoping that there would be one major narrative that could paper over these regional differences in a country that spanned different empires. And it's also used by some stakeholders for reputation rehabilitation to distract from things like corruption, bad governance, and oligarchy. If you can just prove how strong a symbolic history fighter you are, you're hoping you can distract from some of these pronounced government issues. So this is under the hood. I'm just going to breeze through it, but this is the way that qualitative data that I generate is then organized. And I use mixed methods like Chuck, sort of pulling qualitative, but I also try to map it out. I've also done projects where I map using Soviet records, what actually happened in 1932 to 1933. You look at Soviet documents or other documents of any genocide, and you won't expect a perpetrator to say, today I intend to commit genocide against these people. So we use proxy variables to try to indicate for things like intentionality, or to try and get at who specifically they were targeting and their perceptions of who they were targeting. So when I go through Soviet records and I code them according to these proxy variables, the table on the right, that then transforms into something like this, where I can map the particular characteristic of the violence that I'm seeing. And I've used this type of modeling in modern atrocities like Burma, kind of showing that even in a context against the Rohingya people, violence that overall might be characterized as genocidal violence may not be operating at genocidal levels during every period. And so that's something that's really important for trying to seize right moments for intervention or tracking interventions that do. So that's just a little bit under the hood methodologically. Getting back to the case study and what that might say to us today, I just wanted to pull out that what this type of approach tells us about the linkage of historical events and conflict dynamics. The first is that historical processes do influence, contribute, and cause some conflicts. This is not controversial to say, but in the Ukrainian case, it plays out by the Soviet resettlement programs that began in late 1933, where there were lands that were population depleted, meaning many millions of people had killed, were then having resettlement programs of ethnic Russians, of other ethnic members of different Soviet peoples, and they were resettled primarily in places that are having conflict today. Pronounces it's linked to some of the identity ambiguities, it's linked to these contested memories. No, that didn't happen to my ancestors, and it just becomes a little bit pronounced. There's also really fascinating research that shows to this day, you can map voting patterns in Eastern Ukraine, including outside of the conflict areas, that correspond with whether or not a particular area was under that blackboard regime, that there is a relationship there in how those communities continue to vote today. But the thing I wanted to drive home was that it's also not just that history can contribute to conflict dynamics, but the belief that history is repeating itself also can influence, contribute, or even cause some conflict dynamics. And that's again why understanding this cultural context matters for applied peacebuilding work today. There's a reason I have this picture of young military cadets that are taken to the Holodomor Memorial to light a candle for their ancestors who died under something that Ukrainians will call Moscow of the past, before they go to a battlefield with that's sort of controlled by Moscow of today. There's a reason that that is happening. And so again, sometimes I wanted to cut off one of the questions that I get, which is, what is the value of one in-depth case study? So what does that tell us? And what I always say is that it speaks to broader global dynamics. Anthropology is also the quest to understand the sort of holistic approach to these deep questions of human behavior. So my case study alone is a deep case study on one place, but in my larger work, I talk about how this addresses evolving transatlantic postures. So we're getting in NATO, the EU, Ukraine, the United States, I also talk about how Russia's similar tactics in Ukraine are also applied by their military in other fragile states. So these include the Central African Republic, Syria, Libya, Venezuela. And then I also talk about in my more extended work how this might tell us something about the evolving nature of war. And 2 years ago, I mentioned that I expected to see some imitation by China and possibly by Iran of some of the things that Russia does well with disinformation in this context. And this year I started seeing some articles talking about that. So, and I know what is so important for us on the call is that these aren't just flags that represent governments or state institutions, but they also represent millions of impacted people. So just breezing through, check my time, yeah, breezing through, I just wanted to highlight a few other ways that anthropologists have told us something interesting about conflicts and what our approach is, what we sort of see we can say to the peace building puzzle, and then what our other colleagues helped us to uncover. And again, another work that really talks about the interplay of perceptions, so personal perceptions, collective perceptions, societal perceptions, and how these are not static, but they all influence each other and impact social behavior, is this work by Carolyn Nordstrom. So what she's done is she's done a really extended many year ethnography tracking how a lot of weapons are smuggled from their countries of origin through the international system and even into the United States. And one sort of horrifying for me finding that I would teach my students on is that after doing extensive interviewing with US port managers, she realized that although one of the security measures we take is that 6% of cargo is supposed to be screened, that's really just not possible due to the sheer quantity. So what's driving some of the security logic in these places are the belief that security systems are there. And so what that might say to us as we're working to prevent conflict is if we can't convince someone not to have a motive to inflict violence, can we disrupt their supply chain, or can we increase their perception that they'll be caught? This might have significant impacts on their behavior. And so also, I really value that anthropology emphasizes that we should unpack our own assumptions, that we should analyze our own spaces as a unique culture. So this book that I put up here is from 1986. It's called How Institutions Think. It's really been helpful for me in how I seek to understand and to impact bureaucratic systems, how we approach coordinating with partners, and how we robustly and meaningfully engage our own internal assumptions that we take for granted. And so I think that this is really part of a big conversation in peace building right now, pushing for a systems-based approach, sort of recognizing that preventing warfare is all interlinked, even though we might only have one piece of the puzzle that we're working on ourselves. So the inner core here of the strategic peace building wheel has at the bottom violence prevention, conflict response, and transformation, but sees that as linked to structural and institutional change and to things like justice and healing. And then this outer ring has all of the practitioners that are working in these various spaces. And so kind of being able to understand our own conflict ecosystem, the space that we're working, by how our actions also influence those around us is really important, and I think a really fascinating conversation in our field these days. And then just finally, I think one thing that really drew me into this field is the way that it really works to identify gaps. So I love sometimes the macro level quantitative comparative studies, and I do think that they can highlight some very interesting building blocks for us. But sometimes I think anthropologists go in and we begin to talk about, you know, what the cement is like between those building blocks, and often in ways that fundamentally impact our strategies, theories of change, programs, analysis, and more. So this is one example. We were working on programming when I was at the State Department that was seeking to impact youth that might be drawn into violence in Burundi. And one of the fascinating things is we were working with an anthropologist whose work I feature here, who had done a lot of work on youth in Rwanda and in Burundi. And something that we learned was that youth in these contexts was not 18, it wasn't even 21, but it was really linked to a young man's ability to own land, because if he could own land, he could get married. And this was causing significant problems in the context because there just wasn't enough land. And so we really had to rethink what we were doing, because we were working with youths that were often about 35, and that was very different than youths who were 18, especially because at that age, they were alive during other waves of violence. And so kind of being able to unpack these categories and identify gaps has been, I think, something that we bring to the conversation. So thank you so much. We really appreciate our audience who do these presentations. I'm moving us back now to the full screen so we can see each other. And as promised, I'm going to start working through the questions that were raised in the chat. I'm going to invite, first of all, we have Doug Addison. Doug, are you with us? Would you like to ask this question yourself?
Sure, I can do that.
Hi, Doug, welcome.
Hi, very good talk. Appreciate everybody's presentations and appreciate all of this from the entire school. It's been a great day. So the question that I wanted to ask is inspired by the discussion this morning, which was focused on the US. And one of the concerns that was raised was whether the practice and the tools used in the practice are effective or appropriate in the US context. And are they really working? Which made me wonder, is that the best question? Maybe the question is, are they being applied enough? But either way, it comes down to practice and evidence. And I thought I'd just throw that out there for everybody to give their opinions on. So thank you for that.
I will try to answer the question without being an expert in US internal politics. I guess as a foreigner, it's a little difficult to judge, but also as a foreigner, it kind of gives you an outside kind of perspective. So, I'm sorry, there are fighter jets flying right above my apartment, so it just, sorry. I guess the question here is about going back to not only inclusivity, but one other aspect that is important when we're talking about conflict resolution and generating results and preventing a spread of violence, is how we apply it sustainably throughout a long period of time. Unfortunately, it is true in international context, and my assumption is that it is true in the US context as well, that we get distracted and there is no system.
I think we're probably getting some feedback from
to stick to the point where we can see from the in this case. I think my answer to it, I don't think we or practitioners in the US don't apply it. I think there is an issue of fragmentation and a significant fragmentation, not allowed to see more tangible results. And that's kind of my take.
I'll just say something very briefly on this question, and then the next one that Chip House has posed as well. And that is, so I haven't looked at this very carefully myself. I have I would say that certainly the how do we put this? I think when we in the world that some of us have inhabited for the last 20 years, which is that of external interveners. External interveners have more leverage and are listened to more in weak states because of the power differential, right? And that's true all over the world, and it's true of regional powers like Nigeria and Brazil and India, and a place like Nepal, for example, as much as it is true of international, the great powers as well. And so lots of populations either are forced to engage with these peace-building processes, or they have the lovely benefits of engaging with these peace-building processes because of money, international pressure, international attention that is weighed in upon those societies. That's something that's lacking in the United States of America. That's the basic point I want to make on that, right? The second thing is, I think peace and the language of peace is largely discredited in this highly militarized culture in the United States of America vis-a-vis other societies of the world. And so it is, we can debate this, this as well as I. This is not, we might have different opinions on that. And so I think it makes it a higher lift, right? Having said that, I don't think that conflict management and resolution is at all irrelevant in the US context. I think what most people look to is the political system often to resolve conflicts in the United States, and that political system is becoming gummed up and more apparent, and people are despairing of that political system to resolve problems. So who are the communities and the constituencies that might resolve those? Well, the communities that are represented, the most prominent of those these days probably are racial communities. And so what we've seen this year is a real a dynamic of protest and people in the street and debate where political systems have been forced to address those communities that are using protest as an arm. Creates an opportunity for conflict resolution because the conflict becomes prominent or violent. So, and I think that's and there's plenty of conflict management resolution that's been going on for a long time with results at the local level. How do you build that up and replicate that is a real challenge. I'll just stop there.
So just to jump in here, I love what you put, Chip. You said skin in the game. And I think that is something that is stressed in our training as anthropologists, that we have skin in the game wherever we're working, whether it's in our local communities where we were born or whether it's overseas. And I think that maybe that's a healthy lesson because we often are encouraged to be self-reflective in our discipline, because there are, as you can imagine, especially with some of the people we study and the way we do our work, a lot of ethical questions. So one of the things that we talk a lot about is we ask questions, how am I influencing the process that I'm studying? And so I think that if you're going into international context with these questions in your mind, it's a little bit easier to transition back to your home context. And these are great questions. I want to open the floor next to you, Chip, just to make sure we caught the essence of what you asked there. But again, just to emphasize that things that I often hear in American discourse is that we are living in two Americas, right? So people seeing the world or seeing the role of government or seeing what a positive outcome would be in very different ways. Well, that sure has to do with perceptions. I think that we also hear words like inclusivity and legitimacy a lot in our own domestic discourse now, and that has been major themes of our work today, even though we've been looking at other cases. Chip, as promised, now the floor is yours. Would you like to add anything to what you wrote?
Yeah, first of all, let me just add that Margarita's jet planes just flew over my grandkids' house in Falls Church. But, and I don't want to take this line that Doug raised too far, because it would mean hijacking this session, which is really not designed to be about US, but two things grabbed me, and I'll turn the second one into a question. The first is, I went into this work as a 1960s activist. I never studied anything that I didn't have a vested interest in the outcome of. I was never really an outside academic observer. I studied with people like Chuck Tilley, who made me think about the political implications of everything that I did. And so I've never had this sense that I am a third party outside observer going into studying peace processes, or in my case, far left political parties in France. But the question that leads me to is, it is, you know, something that Milt and I have talked about in the 20 whatever years we've known each other, and that is, how do we incorporate, and I don't have an answer for this, how do we incorporate our own personal desires for peace, for social change, and for social justice now into the research that we do, but even more importantly, in the practical work that we do? And I guess, how do we, to go back to this session that Doug and I were in this morning, how do we actually decolonize, to use the current jargon, the research tools, the political tools that we use? I mean, you know, a lot of the data gathered by places like the bank reflect the kind of neoliberal values of those institutions, and I don't know how you go about doing that. So I'm really, at this point, really more here to listen about how this stuff affects how we do our academic analytical work in other places. And I'm babbling, so I'm going to shut up.
Do we have any further comments there? I think some of these are very rich questions that we will probably be sitting with for a while after this panel, which is good. It means it's been a productive panel. So next on our list, or Chuck, did you unmute?
I'm not on mute. Yeah, I mean, I think the field is not addressing the questions you pose, but the field is addressing the questions you pose a little bit, but not very effectively, right? And I think, and there's an extent to which yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated. I think journals will play a role in that. Journal selection, journal editorial boards being more inclusive of global Southern perspectives, et cetera, right? One of the things that I do in the work, in my book, one of the things that I focus on is, and this will be a little bit of an answer to Susan Allen's question that follows in the chat box. I address basically the research and theory implications in one chapter of my findings, and then I have a separate chapter on the policy and practice implications of my findings, which I'm very pleased I did. And I even though it's not necessarily encouraged in academic books these days, I like it. I'm happy I did it, and I hope other people do the same thing. But one of the things in the policy practical I talk about is a critique of international policies. Basically, a number of international policies don't foster inclusion. So one of the things that, and so some of those are democracy promotion policies that focus on elections and withdrawal of international support, which basically put in a leader who can then act in an exclusionary way, and the international community is like hands off because of sovereignty. And so I think that those are models of democracy that, particularly Anglo-American models of democracy, that have been fostered, where winner take all and deference to electoral winners, as opposed to more engaging processes of constituents in polities between elections, let's say. I also acknowledge that basically there's this conundrum of promoting legitimacy as an external actor. External actors who want to promote legitimate governance inside, by their doing that themselves, they may be undermining the internal legitimacy of particular actors as well as processes. And so that's a real delicate thing that is very, hard. And of course, the main way that the American government has done it is to find somebody they like Karzai in Afghanistan, and basically jigger it so that person is in charge. And kingpin, right? Or poach kings. Anyway, so I go through a number of things like that talk about some of the things that are not that foster exclusion. In terms of what I've done, Susan, that is about what I've done in terms of the policy practice world is I was fortunate enough, partly based on my research, to be asked to be a senior advisor to the World Bank UN report on conflict prevention, which resulted in inclusive approaches to development. Basically, it was all about inclusion. Inclusion was it. That was the mantra of that process and that report. It was also, if you read it carefully, a subtle dig at the Paul Collier approach to conflict, which is it's about grievances do matter, which is obviously one of the huge elements of my findings in my book that I've explained, and not just economic opportunities and factors. The other thing I'll mention very briefly also is that one of the things that was emphasized in that report, the 2017 report from the World Bank and the UN on conflict prevention, was the importance of narratives and perceptions, as well as horizontal inequalities. Those are all huge things that should be emphasized coming out of that report that are new to the World Bank. So all the academics say it's not new, there's nothing new about that, but there's a big difference between what's new in academia and what's new to international institutions who haven't listened or looked at it or done anything about it for decades, right? And so this is the moment when those things have been seen now by international institutions. And the last thing I'll say is it would be lovely to have more anthropological work done on these international institutions, something that was sort of present in some of the slides that Kristina was presenting, hinted at in some ways, I think. So I'll stop.
We haven't forgotten your question, Audrey, but just to jump in, Chuck has been answering a question Susan asked, which was a great question about how we plan to make our research most usable by the communities we study or that we work in. And one thing that I just want to jump in here is I think the value of translating our work, but then also the expenses of doing so, that's something that's very important to me. I've already identified the translator for the book I hope to publish first in English, but also the translator that I'd like to work with to get my work translated back, specifically for the communities that I worked with. Because if you're really doing your job right as an anthropologist, you may be interacting with some people who speak many languages, including English, but probably not exclusively English speakers, or there's really a pressure and the onus on us to learn the languages of the communities we work in. So I'm always looking, though, for trying to keep my eye on our field about how that is seen as mattering, because if it matters, I presume that there will be funding or granting institutions for translating our work back for these communities, because especially if they're less common languages, this is expensive often. So that's something important. I think that there's also been a healthy push for open source journals, which is very important, because working a lot with formal interviewing in institutions in Ukraine and elsewhere, a lot of these institutions are not able to support the costs of journals or have trouble getting their journals kind of in our conversations. And so that's important, but I think it's a big conversation for a lot of us here. Margarita, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to address, kind of build on what you and Chuck have said and answer a little bit to Chip's question, Susan's question, and Audrey's question about how we bring our own understanding or desire for social justice into this work, and how we how that inclusiveness matters and how to make this research more relevant. And going from also what you said, I think my belief as a practitioner is we get involved in this type of work because of our own understanding and desire for social justice and peace and positive and constructive contributions. So by being practitioners and by doing this type of work, we actually bring in that value. But I think, as the question was for decolonization, the inclusiveness of our actions is an important part of making research more relevant. And in this case, applying more participatory approaches like participatory action research as a methodological tool for research is an important component. But also, if we do, it is difficult for other voices to get into the academia here. And I think if purposefully seeking collaborations with our colleagues from Global South or from immediate conflict context by including their voices in analytical publications that we do in terms of like co-authorship would be another way of being inclusive. And that kind of goes to the author's question, practicing the inclusiveness that we try to preach, and giving voices to and opportunities to others be represented on the platform that are usually non-accessible to those. So I think that's, and also changing the narrative. I think I had this conversation, like completely offside conversation that with Susan about like publishing in academic journals, and how some journals, there is very kind of rigid understanding of what qualifies as a research methodology and how to kind of tailor to the requirements. I think having more inclusive approaches on that level as well would mean decolonizing our research methodologies and opening more space for others from immediate conflict context to bring their own perspectives into the conversation.
Susan, I wanted to confirm that we'd gotten to the heart of what you were asking, or if you had anything to say. Audrey, as promised, you had asked a really nice question. Would you like to read your question? Or to
yeah, and I'll just, you know, and I've gotten some answers on it. So I guess I'll just throw in here, you know, if there's anything more that anyone wants to say about kind of like the insider-outsider conundrum. I know that anthropology really is looking at this very closely. I think, you know, the field of peace and conflict studies is starting to look at it, but could do a lot more to look at, you know, what does it mean, insider, outsider, like that kind of dichotomy, and, you know, what does it mean for us to be, you know, studying conflict? Like, does that mean we're an outsider, or are we still impacting that? And then, you know, Margarita, you actually anticipated something that I was very interested in terms of methodology and, you know, certain methodologies being legitimized over others, I think. And so I have less of like a really cohesive question and more about, you know, these are some really interesting topics, and to me seem to be kind of evidence of how the Better Evidence Project is going to start moving the field forward around these issues. So I was wondering if I could also hear just a little bit more about concrete ways the Better Evidence Project might address some of these concerns around like legitimacy, decolonization, you know, insider, outsider type issues.
Well, I can just jump in there and answer that. I have to say, as a newly hired executive director, the fact that the Better Evidence Project wanted to take these on and that this was pre-articulated was very attractive for me in wanting to come on board this team. And so I think that when you've assembled 36 different scholars and practitioners and donors, and one of the two main things that comes forward is how do we make sure that locally led peace building successes is contributing and seen as valid and shaping and challenging our evidence base is a wonderful thing. So it's great to have that articulated, and then how we are doing it. Another thing that was really wonderful for me when I was coming on board was to hear our dean at the Carter School, Alf Ozerdem, mention to me that, oh, we've been very careful with their advisory board to make sure that we're including those voices. We will have a variety of hub activities and working groups that are in process right now, and that's something that we've had internal conversations about, making sure that those working groups are representing people from various contexts, including the Global South, including active conflict contexts, as well as representing this variety of methodologies that we've mentioned. So I think going forward, that's also something that I would love to hear community feedback on. We all have deep ties to the peace building field, so concrete suggestions are things that I would hope that you always feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to bep@gmu.edu if you want to jump on board, or if you want to even send a laundry list of things that are based on your practice experience. But those are some of the things that we're doing right now.
If I may, I want to kind of address Mil's question about which of our findings are more useful and may have the most influence on what peace builders do in the future. We will be the larger report that I have produced or in the research, we will be rolling out that report in November. So I would encourage all of you to kind of join that discussion as well. But to keep the focus on today's theme, I guess I will say that I still do think that the inclusiveness and trying to support and understand the inclusiveness would be one of the central components that is not only was evident from the different from the analysis of political interventions led by international organizations, but also from my own personal dissertation research and also practice work, how if not careful, we can make processes that are intended to be inclusive very exclusive, which affects negatively the peace processes and the support to those processes. And by that I mean a lot of times we or interveners have generate a certain group of people that they are comfortable working with, they're on the same page or they have access to, the same ways the international donors work with the organizations that either speak their own language or are able to be in touch with them. So in essence, creating dialogue process or intervention processes that in essence and in their original logic needs to be inclusive, very exclusive for the local context. So I think recognizing that for the practitioners is very important, and also that recognition has to transcend from the peace builder level to actually donor and policymaker level, to understand, like to emphasize that while we need to appreciate the successes and the effectiveness of certain project or a group or an initiative that is working, by keeping that initiative as is for a long time will make it completely exclusive and will generate resentment in the public where we work, and will defeat the purpose of our intervention. So I think purposeful thinking about how not to make inclusive processes exclusive by our own practices would be one of the things that I would certainly highlight, not only based on this research, but from my practical experience as well.
So we're lucky, Chuck, I was hoping you would jump in here, putting you on the spot, but we have Chuck, who did something very interesting in his book that is behind him. And what was so, I think, fascinating about it is you gave this wealth of material, this wealth of different kinds of methods, and then you wrote one chapter really for theory, for what academics might do to push, to tug on your work, to apply it. And then you wrote another chapter, which was how it relates to practice. And so I was hoping that you could help us understand how you sat down with this wealth of data and then walked yourself through, writing these applications of your work for different audiences. How do you approach applying research in these ways?
I'm happy to do that. So, and I've already mentioned a little bit of of some of the content of what I said in the policy chapter, right? I think that it was assisted by the fact that I had been working in the UN, and then I was still working very much around the UN and its peace building architecture, as they call it, for a number of years, right as I was writing this book. And then, so yeah, I think it's one of the things that I point out in the book, though, is that it's very dangerous for policymakers to assume that their findings have direct policy applicability. And the example I give in the book is the democratic peace thesis. So lovely, all the academics who celebrate the democratic peace thesis are so happy because they found a formula for interstate peace. It's fantastic. And the most immediate policy implication for that, as I tell my students, is obviously, let's go make democracies. Unfortunately, we know from scholarship that making democracies causes violence and conflict. So that there's basically there's not a direct applicability of a research finding with immediate with obvious policy implications, because the policy implications are not always obvious. And so you have to look critically at what you think the policy implication might be and reflect critically on whether or not you have to actually study that policy intervention or policy implication has a dependent variable to see actually if it is, has whether or not its effects are positive or negative, including our efforts to foster legitimacy. So let's go make legitimate states. Well, we're not in a position to do that. It's a little ironic. I mean, it's a little catch-22. So, I mean, I think a lot of times, yeah, that's what I was going to say. I'm just going to respond to a number of things that are on the table here, and one of them is the decolonization. So I think there's a lot of stuff that has been talked about and been being done for the last many years along these lines, certainly in the peace building field, which is bring voices of people and populations in these societies more directly into shaping, designing, and of programs. Most importantly, also in M&E, sort of how are populations involved in monitoring and evaluation of these programs as well? How are they involved in implementation, et cetera? In terms of scholarship, we have a lot more emphasis on, you know, I'm involved right now in a book project that's externally funded by Ford and others that involves collaborative writing with a Guatemalan academic partner. And, you know, these are not easy processes, et cetera. I think it's really important to look at these issues from multiple perspectives across the globe now. So I was very pleased that I was part of a project called Rising Powers in Peacebuilding, which resulted in an edited volume called Rising Powers in Peacebuilding, that I edited with a South African scholar who's in Norway. And we had think tanks involved that were partners in that in South Africa, in Turkey, Indonesia, and I'm leaving one out, which is Brazil was also involved, and I'm leaving another one out. India. And so that was great because those are their perspectives on peace building from those countries' perspectives, and I think we need more of that. But at the end of the day, we're still scratching the surface of moving in those directions, and that's what I got to say about that. Yeah.
I think one of the main pieces that helps me in this kind of work too is we're just sort of pushed in our anthropological training to understand that you're never fully neutral. So there's never any sort of net negative that your action could have. And so being very sensitive with security training. So also confirming with the people in local who are still going to be in local context, do you want to be listed as a co-author? I would like to acknowledge you in my acknowledgement section. Is that okay? Just going the extra step to think through anything that I'm doing may impact them. But then also to accept the fact that we kind of say that insider-outsider debate is not even asking the right question because you're not really going to be either. So you're never going to have the full mindset, no matter how self-reflective you are, that you're studying. And so going in with some intellectual humility, and also then structuring diversity in such a way that you just try to get a different group of people in the room. So making sure that, you know, that I was based in Kyiv, but not always there, going out to the different places in the regions, talking with people who were born in one place and another, or talking with someone who was now 20 and was born after Ukraine was an independent state versus someone who I interviewed some people who spent 2 decades in Soviet prison camps. And so, you know, there's just going to be different perspectives. And so beyond being from the same city, making sure that there's a variety of experiences included, because you really can't get around that. I wanted to welcome Mary Kate, if you would like to ask your question or say a word or two.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just really enjoying this whole conversation. I'm wondering, it's kind of related to the USA questions, but it's something else that we've sort of exported in a colonial way is our social media platforms and the algorithms that are trying to keep people engaged with them, but that often then end up prioritizing very partisan and at times inflammatory narratives. And wondering if you've seen the impact of that, if that's going to be influencing the landscape of peace building as we move forward.
I can say a word or two. One of the projects that I became involved with after I came back from my fieldwork was working with an interdisciplinary team that actually looks at social media in various contexts. And so I usually pitch in as their Eastern Europe person or Ukraine person, but they are peacebuilding scholars who are partnering with a computer science department at the University of Notre Dame to track inflammatory memes, and then also looking at where they originate from, how media is being distorted, and specifically looking at the ones that call for violence. And so this work is very much in progress, but they're looking at a variety of case studies, including Russia, including Ukraine, including Indonesia, Colombia, and elsewhere. So I know that this topic is going on. We're not yet to the point where there are results. There's research design going on this topic, but I do think that it's not the way I approach this issue, and I could be wrong. It's not my area of specialty, but I sort of see human behavior dynamics being applied through a new technology. So I think that it's a new technology. I'm not sure that some of the polarization or things like that we're seeing is particularly new. But I do have a question that I bring up in some of my larger work, which is every so often in conflict, we get a technological shift that results in a paradigm shift. So guns, dynamite, tanks, things like that, big developments in technology. And so one of the questions that I've been asking for a few years is if we are in, not necessarily exclusively social media driven, but if we are in a paradigm shift moment in the history of conflict, as disinformation campaigns or social media inflammation are linked to changes in asymmetric conflict. So where we used to think about asymmetric conflict being used by less dominant actor states in Iraq or Afghanistan, if we're now seeing these tactics used by the dominant actor in conflicts like Russia or like China. So the jury's still out on that, but I am really watching that closely.
I'm going to take a gander at I don't know, some of these questions that Milt Lowenstein is asking here. And so I was dancing around some of that earlier about which of the findings are most useful. So the first thing I would say in terms of my own research being useful is going to be, I do believe that academics often have the most powerful policy impact by going into policy making positions and institutions. And I would say that one of the things that happened with me was being involved with the World Bank UN report for that year, 2016, 2017 was really great, because one of the things that we fostered through that report was to try to get big multilateral development banks to do things differently. And that is the way the development banks do things in conflict environments is basically to fund states and stay out of politics. And that still is too much the case, even though the World Bank has shifted more and more away from that and tried to wrestle with that. But that report was very much aimed at the fact that the World Bank didn't anticipate or respond agilely to the Arab Spring. And it was it was struggling with how to respond to these complex situations where you have armed conflicts, divided states, and pressure to engage with non-state actors like the opposition that was holding territory in northern Syria. And how do they deal with Assad, who has no legitimacy? And how can political scientists help them understand that better? And I think the inclusive message, the emphasis on inclusive development that came out of that report is basically a license for World Bank country managers finally to be able to walk into the head of state's office and say, we really want to support you. We want to give you that $20 billion or $300 million, but really we need to see that there's an inclusionary element to that package before we release that money. And that has now on the table in a way that it is not in as powerful a way as it was before. And that's huge because the World Bank and the multilateral development banks are the most influential pocket of money that are out there in this space, okay? So is that leveraging? Is that arm twisting? Absolutely it is. And I absolutely support it if it's in favor of inclusionary processes. And so that's one thing that's out there that I just want to point to. I mean, I think our research rarely has a direct impact on policy, generally speaking. We should just be thankful when it does in some very tiny way. The way that I would hope that my research has an impact is basically to get international actors to not think about inclusion and not just let exclusionary processes unroll unchecked in post-conflict situations, which is so often the case where you have a leader who acts in an exclusionary way, and the international community, because they are elected in a democratic election, supposedly, are going to be hands off and let things roll out of control. And so that's and that has wrapped very much into the Sustainable Development Goals, where inclusion is also part of the development matrix for the states are measuring themselves by as well. And so those are really powerful matrices that are out there by which states will need to measure themselves going forward. The other thing I just want to say in response to Mary Kate and Kristina's comments about the changing nature of conflict and how do we address the information. I mean, I think the world is changing and technology is changing the whole space that we're working in, and we are very slow to adapt. And that means especially the use of social media to divide and to deepen division is so strong, and that the ability to try to bridge those gaps, I imagine this was discussed in this morning's sessions on the United States of America, is so deep that it's very difficult to figure out how to either try to bring those segments across toward one another in the social media space, or to bridge or to even use those toward peace building objectives. And I think that's one huge challenge, but also the very nature of conflict, as Kristina said, in terms of informational warfare, artificial intelligence. How do we monitor? I mean, we're really behind on setting up systems, multilateral systems that will monitor and that are third-party confidence building mechanisms to monitor and report on these that can gain some traction. And that includes AI developments, as well as information warfare, as well as election interference, as well as fake news, etc. Sorry.
We do have just a few brief minutes left. This event has flown by. I want to thank all of our participants and especially our speakers. Since we do have such short time, I just want to welcome any final questions that aren't in our chat list. If anyone feels that they really have something burning that they want to raise to the floor right now, we'd welcome that.
When I hear...
Yes, we hear you, Milt.
Okay. When I hear those presentations and the quality and the understanding of war, peace building, and so on, I want to celebrate. It's wonderful. And then I stop and say, well, what impact is that going to have on the amount of warfare next year or 5 years or 10 years from now? And how does that understanding seep into what people do so that we don't have so much warfare?
Well, I think that one immediate response to that is I think a lot of, I know what Chuck and I are asking, and I think Margarita, tell me if this is fair, but I think that you also really look at recurrence of conflict or historical feelings emerging into a new form of violence. In your report as well, you mentioned, for example, that some of the cases that are successful during some periods are then not later. And so I think that we might look at your question, Milt, and say, if we are counting the number of conflicts on 2027, maybe it would be numerically a low number and we could all, rejoice. But then what would we find the next year? With some of the things that we feel so successfully resolved, would they fall prey to some of the dynamics that we've raised today because they had not built in things like legitimacy, inclusivity, accounting for people's perceptions? And so that's, I think, one answer, to also be aware of the fact that reducing conflict will hopefully be an achievable goal, but that it may not be static, that we'll have to keep returning to the table to make sure that we don't rest on our laurels. And so that's one way that I begin to approach that.
I think a lot will depend on the back row big power relations also. It's just really hard to, it's hard to, there are trends of away from multilateralism, trends toward sovereignty, trends toward isolationism that make it very difficult for research of the sort that we've been doing to have the kind of impact that it has perhaps had before 5 years ago, when these great power tensions started to grow. And I think we need to look more seriously at those great power tensions as well, and how they're articulated in the rest of the world.
And if I just may add one other dimension to what Chuck and Kristina have mentioned, I think one other aspect is to work together, and I think Better Evidence Project is trying to do so, but also kind of branching out from that and reaching further to reduce the fragmentation of our efforts. And I think this type of project and this type of collaborations are aimed at that. I think that enriches our understanding what conflict, peace, and sustainability and effectiveness is across the board. And I think by doing so, we can help reduce the conflict in years to come, not only numerically, as Kristina has mentioned, but also sustainably in a way that enriches our understanding of what is lack of conflict, or what is the reduced conflict. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
Well, I think that we are drawing near to the time where our event is ending. Are there any final comments from our 2 speakers who have so adroitly answered a variety of questions? Chuck, Margarita, any final words? You're good? Okay.
I just want to thank you for organizing it and for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. And again, like I'm gonna use this time and say, join us on November 19th, I think.
At 2 p.m.
At 2 p.m. for the rollout of the report and further discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks very much to our participants. I think that this panel has left me with some very burning questions that will follow me into what should be a relaxed Saturday morning. So I'm very grateful to everyone for their participation. I do want to thank Chuck Hall and Margarita Tadevosyan for giving of their time so generously and sharing their research with us today. Thanks to all of you, and we will post this event online. I've been informed that it will be about several weeks before it's posted online, but we hope that you'll feel free to share it with your colleagues and networks. And thank you very much to our speakers and to our audience.
And thank you, Kristina, for convening this. Thank you.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.